Hello artists, this demo is going to cover some basic approaches to getting paint onto our canvas now that we've completed our sketch. And we've also completed the color wheel. So you're going to want your canvas out. You're going to also want this color wheel in your sketchbook nearby, open, as well as your sketch with detailed colors or photo references or both. So you sort of need these items beside you as you work. And I am going to go through some important general points and techniques. The very first step that you might do is to simply choose a background or whatever the largest area of color is, and on your palette you're going to really mix up. I've been working on this custom green. Just really incorporate a really good sized amount of that color. So always mix a custom color. Try to avoid anything straight out of a tube. Just doesn't look as good. Even if all you do is you take, let's say I'd taken green and then I'd added some drops of white just to brighten it slightly. Paint is going to darken as it dries, so you kind of want to keep that in mind. And then you can work from general to more specific small details in your image. To do a background, so general to specific as well, back to front. So thinking of painting as coming forwards. I recommend using your largest brush if it's a big, large area, but the first thing that you might do is you might want to outline or sort of protect the main contours of your images with a medium or smaller sized brush. So just giving that crisp edge, not rushing yourself too much, just trying to protect what you know is different from the background. And once a lot of it is outlined, then you can feel a bit more confident going in, for example, with a larger brush and just kind of filling it in. So I don't know if anyone did this when they had coloring books as a kid, but if you knew you were going to do blue somewhere, you could almost outline that shape with the blue, sort of defining the edges. And then that helped to give you the confidence to just fill in the rest. So even in an area like right here, I'm going to first get the contour, okay, a little more defined. So contouring it with the appropriate sized brush, and then you have the confidence to fill it in. So as I move to my larger brush, again, you don't want too much paint. That should be sort of the amount. You're not wanting the paint to come all the way up to the ferrule. And then similar to a coloring book, I don't know if anyone did this trick, it really can help to try to paint in a consistent direction. So that might mean following the contours as I'm doing here, or that might mean, I don't know, that you're wanting to just paint vertically, so sort of up and down, including right off the edges, being careful of the desk, but just sort of large, broad strokes in the background, okay, as you're filling it in, and that might be a great place to start. Once all of this dries, you may find there still is paint on your palette and you're wanting to add a second coat. Very, very common, especially if it's a lighter color. You may want to add a second coat of paint. Same thing for if it dries but a bit unevenly and you're just wanting to come back in and just kind of reincorporate. So I've filled in this area and I would keep on going all throughout, making sure that I'm getting a good solid general background color, and we can build upon that color once it's dry. Okay, so back to front, and if that means you need to take your pencil and redraw some of the lines that were lost, perfectly normal, perfectly okay to do. I'm going to quickly talk about the 6 different techniques that we are going to incorporate. The first one, blending, is the most important one, and I'll begin there. So with blending, the idea is that you're going, just like we've done with pencil sets, value scales, lighter to darker tones will give the illusion of roundness or depth. So in this version, you can see where in the sunglasses, and I want to look at my sketch or my reference photo to remind me, yes, these have different values and different shades, and I want to start to show that rather than just filling it in as a solid yellow or a solid pink kind of color. So if we're working in blending, the real trick is simply this. Whatever color you're going to do, and let's say I'm going to work with yellow, okay, so here, I really want to mix ahead of time using my popsicle stick, a light, medium, and dark version of that yellow at the absolute minimum. So the minimum being 3, right? Like 1, 2, 3. This was basically the yellow out of the tube. And I've taken it and I've added white gradually, or I've added the complementary color. So you look at your color wheel and you remind yourself to darken my yellow. I'm going to add purple. And I've done all of that ahead of time. Another trick is you can go in the yellow area over one direction or the other into tertiaries. So I could make the yellow more of a greeny yellow or more of an orangey yellow. So in this case, I tried for a bit of an orangey yellow, and eventually I might get right down to a brown. Having them mixed in advance is really critical to the success of this. And then just using, again, I would start back to front and general to specific. So I might take a larger brush and lay down a mid-tone. So let's say I'm working in this part of the sunglasses, laying down this sort of mid-yellow first, just generally. And the fact that this paint is still wet is actually helpful for the technique of blending because you want everything done in advance so that you can work quickly. From there, depending how the light is falling, I can add a bit of lighter tones and even lighter tones. And I'm just moving my brush in the direction that I see the lens shadows or highlights going. Sometimes if the paint's still really wet, you can add a pure white to that, okay? I can do the same over on this side. So working in 2 different areas, as well as, okay, I'm gonna start to add in these deeper oranges. And you notice that I haven't rinsed the brush in the process of a blend. That's okay. We want maybe sometimes a bit of a dirty brush technique or a colored brush where those colors can be picked up and built upon. Okay, now here I kind of lost my mid-tone, so I'm gonna just rinse and kind of reset and come back in, just softening that blend. And maybe even, again, coming in with a stronger white highlight till I start to feel that I've got a good sort of value variation throughout. And so I would do that while I have this color, right, this yellow, anywhere in my canvas that I know the yellow is going to be. So if that yellow, you know, also existed right here or on these, let's say, I'm going to find sort of the right brush for the job, choosing that yellow, and that way you're not wasting any paint or feeling frustrated trying to remix a color that you just can't quite achieve on the next day. So anywhere that you need that yellow to go, just go with it, okay? And then you're going to allow that to dry. And you can always sort of refine it using a smaller brush, okay? Or even using a damp, clean brush that has almost no paint on it. You can drag that across to sort of blur out any lines. So Blending is really critical. You can see the amounts of different paints that it can sometimes take to achieve that blend, whether it's in the background like a sky or in an object, but that's the idea with blending, okay? Band-Aid dots or pointillism. If you're going to include this look, it just depends whether you are doing pop art, right, which will make use of a Band-Aid dot, or if you're doing impressionism, it'd be more of a pointillism. So the Band-Aid dots, I would recommend sketching out in advance. And I did that here and I can still see them. So I would follow the circles that I've sketched. And the goal is trying to maybe keep your brush really vertical, trying to keep that circle really uniform and even. So it just might take a little bit of control using that brush, again, in a dabbing or in a circular motion, and following what you had planned out. So Band-Aid dots, you can see I did some larger ones here. They go in sort of a uniform grid, just staggered like a checkerboard or a chessboard would be. So again, I'm just lightly indicating where those dots seem to be. And as these orange colors dry, I might come in and do a second coat. Again, oranges, yellows, whites, those are really light colors and they can be tricky. If you're doing pointillism, and I can just show that somewhere else on here in the background, the idea would be you have a solid color laid down first, and then my impressionists, you want to, I don't know, sort of add in smaller, more randomized dots of a similar color, okay? But maybe using different values and just kind of layering them so you could see how that pointillism is more dependent on the brush itself. And you even could experiment with using the end of your brush, which you'll notice those are all rounded. So just to show what type of dot effect that gives, it's a little more prominent. Sometimes that's a bit more of a preferred, precise kind of a dot look. So either end of your brush, in a bit more of an overlapping way for pointillism, and in more of a controlled uniform way for the Band-Aid dots. So you can see those differences right here. Okay, the next technique is something called dry brush. So with dry brush, both the paint surface, okay, the canvas, and basically the brush or bristles should be relatively dry. And this is going to allow you to build in color, but in sort of a wispy, subtle way. So I'm coming with this light pink dry brushing, and then if I came with a red to dry brush, you might be able to see just slightly better. You're actually wanting that sort of streakiness or the visible mark making to be apparent. So I'm using hardly any paint. You can almost hear it scratching away on there, okay? And a really neat effect with dry brush can be to just pick up the textures of the canvas itself, reminding people that this is in fact a painting. So enjoying the inherent texture of that canvas, the texture of these bristles here. And one last trick or a place where it's really useful is if you have mist or clouds or a reflection, you can come in with white, okay? I could even come in with white. I'll just show on the background so it's easier. Don't get too much paint. I sort of got a bit too much there. Remember, if it's dry brush, I do want it to be dry. So I sometimes tap off the excess, and then it lets you, the less paint that there is, the more you can kind of create. This is nice for clouds or mist, or I think I said water, or just layering in maybe a highlight that was lost when you first began. So dry brush, really soft technique. It will dry very quickly, so it's easy to build up layers and kind of feel that you have a little more control. But the idea is we do want those visible brush strokes, and you kind of want that texture of the brush really showing. Okay? So dry brush, good, useful one. If you're doing a super large area, you might borrow one of these larger sort of household paintbrushes just to wisp in clouds or mist or any other sort of overtop layer, making sure things are dry and that this is relatively dry. Okay, next technique is super helpful for all sorts of things, and that is simply taping. So using the same masking tape that we use, whether it's thick, like this one here, or a thinner one, this is going to give you more precise edges and lines. And if I wanted this right here, this little space, to be super, super crisp, or even over here, let's say I want to protect part of my painting, I can lay down this green painter's tape, and just making sure that the edge is really cleanly pressed down is one of the first steps, just to make sure it's going to give you a good result. You can tape off areas that are curved, so like under my sunglasses here, but you're just going to need to keep tearing up the tape slightly and applying it in short little pieces to recreate those angles or those curves. So I'm taping around things. You could tape to cover up something as well. I could cut out a piece of scrap paper and tape it if I needed to really protect this circle, for example. And then the only last key with taping is, first of all, you don't want your brush to have too much water. So you can use your apron, or you can use, just trying to think, or you could use paper towel to just make sure your brush isn't too damp. So I'm gonna come here with a bit of this gray, okay? And you can paint with the tape, like so. Absolutely you can. Or it sometimes is even more crisp if you go right over. So you guys can see I'm going sort of the opposite. I taped it horizontally, so I'm doing these short little brush strokes. I'm going to let that dry so I can come work over here. Same. And of course you can be precise without taping, but it's just a nice option if you need a really crisp area or an edge that's super clean. Maybe it's a horizon line, maybe it's the edge of some item or object, like what I'm doing here. And then you're gonna wanna probably give it always a couple of coats of paint, possibly a couple of different directions. And then you want that to dry fully before you take the tape off. Okay, I'm just peeling mine back so that you can visually see it, but you wanna let it dry so that hopefully the paint won't bleed underneath. So that's taping. And we are now arriving at the last two techniques, which are really just about changing the consistency or the thickness of the paint. So one is called impasto and one is called glazing. With impasto, you're gonna make your paint much thicker and visible in its texture. And with glazing, you're gonna dilute or thin out your paint and almost make it act more like a watercolor. So if you're doing impasto, you're going to find one of these containers that has inside some white powder. And this white powder is actually plaster dust. So using the small container within here, you're going to just take some of that plaster dust to something in your painting. I'll thicken up this light pink here. So I'm going to shake a bit of the plaster onto the acrylic, and then using my mixing stick, I'm just going to incorporate it in. And you'll notice as you're stirring that it's getting some thicker body to it, okay, and that it's got much more of a visible texture. So it will go from sort of a thick milk or cream to more of almost like a pudding or a paste, okay? And then where you go to use it, I'm just gonna do this heart here. I'd like a puffy heart. Sometimes I actually apply the initial impasto with my mixing stick. Just depends how thick you really want it to be. And of course you can come back in and use a brush and clean it up, or this might be a good area to have taped off in advance. But that's kind of the idea. You get this thicker, more textural kind of look where the paint stands up. And for people doing impressionism, sometimes this is a really nice option if you want those visible brush strokes, right? If I were to do that with a bit of white here, just mixing it up. So you can do it with any color, of course, but just incorporating that plaster and even almost painting with your palette knife or your popsicle stick is going to give this very thick, textural kind of a look to your image. So it's called impasto from the Italian, meaning impassable. So it's a very thick and dense, rich look. Last one for glazing, you could dilute your paint with water, absolutely. It sometimes is a bit streaky when we do that though. So we have these matte mediums or gloss mediums, and I know it looks like white. Just read the label carefully. And what this actually is it's a fluid acrylic that has no pigment in it. So I'm gonna just add it near a couple of the colors that I think I might want to use for this. So if I've added it here to this blue and I just start to incorporate, it's gonna take that blue and make it a little more transparent as I paint it. Same thing over here in these greens. So you just need a little bit of the color, adding it in to the medium. And the more of this fluid medium you have with less color, then the more glazed looking or glossy looking it's going to be, the more transparent it will be. So hopefully you can see as I'm adding down here, it's looking very watery, it's very translucent and transparent. And that's kind of sometimes really nice, depending on the area where you're using it or the look you're going for. I, again, would suggest going over a base color. So with my green here, I'll just kind of go over an area of the background. This translucent green, it's not gonna totally change. In fact, anything I've painted previously, okay, is still gonna show through, but it's just giving me a way to modify and layer with really thin paint over top of things. So this yellowy green might be an effect that I'm wanting for whatever reason. Okay? So again, we want to keep our sketch and our color wheel nearby. We want to use the right size of brush, from little teeny tiny to really, really large, the right size tool for the job. We want to make use of all of these techniques, mainly blending, bend-aid or pointillism, dry brush, taping, impasto, and glazing. These are your main 6 ones, along with the idea that we're going from the back to the front and from more general, large shapes and areas down to little specific details. Good luck and have fun.